Hello, everyone. Linker here with the podcast featuring the people that make the AFKArena community what it is. And today we have a very powerful guest, one that I'm very happy to introduce. Will you say hello?
Hi, this is Shizzam. You may recognize me from Reddit or from the Legends Championship, especially if you're in Region 8. I'm also deputy of Cloud and Cloud9. In real life, I'm 35 years old, from London in the UK, and work in finance.
All right. And Shazam is being very humble over here, saying that he just casually helps. He's a huge partaker in the community. He had collaborations with major content creators in the past, some that we've already had on this channel, and he's one of the leaders of one of the biggest guilds in the game, running for those top spots alongside casuals and the other top Chinese meta. Shizam is in Cloud. So Shizam, before we dive into the game, because I think you're one of the most knowledgeable guests we've had here about it, why won't you tell us about who you are in real life?
I'm 35. I'm based in London, as I said earlier. And I work in finance. So I deal a lot with numbers. I deal a lot with money. So I guess that background kind of helps put context to how to delve into a game like this. So if you're going to spend, how to make the most of any money you do spend. From my perspective as well, I've always liked computer games. I grew up with them. So yeah, I guess probably the background of me that the community is interested in.
Right, Shazam is in the very end game, chapter 35, if I recall right now, and the guy's made a lot of summary about the game. So one of his most big posts that blew up recently is he took the different replays of chapter 35 and he summarized them into a lot of data. I used it myself. I personally really liked it. Is there anything there that you found very special?
Yeah, there's a whole story behind that. And to answer your question directly, it's always good to take a look at what the cutting edge is. I know not everyone finds it useful because the people who are at that stage of the campaign have spent considerably, have access to a lot of heroes. And I know those types of people, those types of whales, do have a reputation of using overpowered lineups. And yeah, that is true to a certain extent. If you are at the edge of the campaign, there is no precedent. You aren't sure what would work. So you would naturally use your strongest heroes and, the Celepagians and Dimensionals with signature items at level 40 will, of course, outperform, your other hero. But I do think taking a look at that, trying to understand why it works. If you can watch the replay, watch the replay. If you only see the battle report, that's still a lot of data. You can start kind of reverse engineering the thought process, and then you can do that iterative process, which the whole community does, where you unpick what makes a formation work and then substitute in what you have available. And as more players progress to, chapter 35 or wherever, there's going to be more and more, that iterative process filters down until the winning formations are more attainable. I can give you a story around why I did it, but
Really?
yeah, of course, I'm planning to. But although this guy does set out, these very celestial and hypergean biased lineups, I do think it still adds a lot of value. And if you want to know why I did it, a few months ago. So the other reason why I did this is a few months ago, Volkin asked me to do an endgame hero tier list, and I'd put it together based on, I was in chapter 34 at the time, so I did take a look at the winning formations around where I was at. I used my own personal experience, and everyone's biased, right? There's lots of heroes I don't use that other people love, and I caveated that tier list with, even bad heroes can do great things in the right lineup, or take any tier list with a grain of salt. And I put it out there, put it in Reddit, hand it over to Volkin to do on one of his videos, and there was a great reaction, great positive reaction in YouTube and in Reddit. But when there was somebody from Volkin's community who posted it on the community page within the game, and that had a bit of a backlash. And
I never heard of that.
it's I can understand it. It's an unmoderated chat community, and you have people there who are usually quite new to the game, who your usual thing, why isn't Shamira at the top of the tier list? So I know all of that, and notwithstanding that, when I listened to the feedback, I knew I could back up my tier list with data. I just hadn't published the data and I hadn't made the tier list about the data. So at that time, I thought, I can do this better. Next chapter, when I hit chapter 35, let's take a look at all those winning formations. I want to know what they're like. I want to make a tier list that's objective, not subjective. And then I think the community, the wider community, and certainly my guild would benefit from seeing that type of data.
I definitely hear you. I think you touched on many important points in there. So let me first unpack that. If I get you right, what you're saying is that you started by looking at the data around you and you came up with this tier list. people in the community, especially like on Reddit and on Volkin's YouTube, really had an overwhelmingly positive response to it. It wasn't data backed at the time, but it's something that you really had in the back of your mind kind of for a while to really post the data so that people can also make their own mind unbiased from all the different things. Because obviously everybody is to some extent, but people really liked it. And then you came up with this one that was more data backed, because in this case you were just giving facts. It wasn't opinionated in any way. Just said, look, this hero is used this percent of the time. And so the community really loved that too. Is that basically where you're at?
Exactly.
I hear you. One thing I do want to get your opinion on is, what is one insight that you got from it? Because obviously you concentrated all of this data. You also have your own opinion. You made your progress in the game very far. I think you're the first guest in this podcast to have made it farther than me. So maybe you can give even better insight. What is the one formation that really, or one piece of data that really struck you, like one thing that you didn't anticipate at first?
When I looked at, the earlier part of chapter 35, was we were missing a lot of combinations which I knew were great. Your Iron Skriath combination, which is amazing. And I know from looking at the data, it is usually the same 10 people, and they do have personal biases, and that flows through. We've got some players, I don't want to name names, who really like dimensional heroes. So they use these very wacky dimensional hero lineups, which make no sense to me at all. But so there's that side of it, and for me that was very useful insight, because these players are also the ones I and my guild face in PvP in Legends Championship. So to be able to see kind of their logic and their thought processes, how they construct their teams, really was really great. Just for that was really great insight, just to help give me a edge for myself and my guild. But setting that part aside and just looking at how you construct winning combinations, it became very clear that everyone always tries to go for more than one win condition. You don't just want Euron as your damage dealer. You don't just want to rely on Thoran's retaliation. You need, just from an RNG perspective, you've got to have 1, 2, or even 3 ways of winning each fight. And it showed when I looked at the replays that the same lineups can have completely different winning conditions, different damage dealt, different damage absorbed, etc. So it became clear that the key is to not just rely on one trick. I mean, yeah, your Gwyneth burst, Gwyneth sat behind Arthur will always be one trick, so you don't need to defend that with your Hendrik or whatever. But you want to rely on that as little as possible, and if you are going to rely on that, you want to put that to the front of your 5 rounds. So yeah, that really came to the forth. And what I learned from doing this is, I mean, I've never been a Kelther fan, but after going through all those winning formations and how he's everywhere, I'm gonna have to invest in Kelther myself, even though he's not very useful in PvP. And similarly, there are standout heroes that I wasn't expecting to see. I was always thought there would be no maulers. There are some, which I know there are lots of maulers lovers out there, but I didn't expect to see any use of maulers the way they're being used. So yeah, I mean, there are a few concepts, especially around the Graveborn side. Your use of Kelther, which I'm going to have to take that away, test, and weave into my own hero lineups.
I hear you. That makes a lot of sense, since when you look at the players that do these kinds of replays, many times you have this certain set that will consistently perform high at those ranks. Like, people look at the amount of data that you gathered and they think, look, this is the holy grail of statistics that we have in the game. And that would be completely true. But then again, talking about how there's like a specific fraction of people that still allow for some bias is something good to remember. And taking away the piece about Kelther, I think, is very interesting. Skriath falling off surprised me. Satrana being a high performer really surprised me. That's one thing I really didn't prepare for. I guess there's something to her. And personally, like, how do you approach campaign leveling, stuff like that?
You've got to test a lot, right? I mean, you have your own, what works in certain situations, and you that's your starting point, and you say, okay, I know what that enemy team's going to do. I know what the crunch points are. If Solace ults, I'm dead. So how you need to construct your team to kind of counter that. And that's something that evolves over time with each patch, with each new game mechanic. When I started back in August last year, signature items were everywhere. Great. They introduced the Elder Tree. That kind of had a linear increase to all the stats. So everything got stronger. And because hero abilities tend to have higher multipliers, attack abilities rather than defense abilities, it shifted kind of how you went about winning matches away from, relying on healing and relying on tanks to having a lot of burst damage. And with the introduction of furniture, which has stats improvements going in the other direction, I mean, furniture have buff defense, triple the amount of buffs attack.
Right.
You're all of a sudden your heroes have become even more robust, and you don't need it. You can see it in the way people play and the way the game's developing that you can rely more on strong damage dealers. I mean, Iron's just fantastic in it, and you can see he's everywhere. Leica's had a massive boost. And so when I come about constructing my campaign game, formations, it's always changing. It's never static. It's what worked 6 months ago, what worked 3 months ago. It isn't necessarily what's the best now. And there's so much innovation flowing through from the lower chapters, and I can learn so much just by seeing people post in Reddit at lower chapters what works for them, and I can take that, widen that, broaden it, apply it to the niche situations where I've got gaps in what I do, and then I test and test. There's a bit of, thinking, there's a bit of theory crafting, but I mean, this as well as I do. How the abilities are described on paper are nothing like how they translate into practice. So you've got to have some real experience to back anything like that up. And that's how I kind of construct the way I play. And I don't like running matchups that have a lot of RNG. I don't want to have to run the same fight for 3 hours just to pass. I don't think that's how the game is intended to be played. I think you need to actually take a look and say, okay, why isn't this lineup working? What do I need to tweak? Why does my carry die so quickly? And there's obvious reasons. It's positioning, but you could just got to think, well, what other hero can do that same role, and just try and find a better way and keep finessing and tweaking your own lineups until you do find something that's a bit more optimal and a bit more interesting.
I hear very much. Let me quickly give just an example of mistranslation so the viewers know what it's about. Maybe it'll help somebody. Like, for example, we see Ezio's description on his furniture. It says 3 out of 9. If he's executing the kill during the kill, this is what the text literally says, he'll cleanse himself from CCs. So you think, okay, during stunts he cannot kill, which means that he cannot kill to cleanse himself. But what one member of my Discord found is that what actually does in game is that it cleanses him when he can perform it, which means it doesn't rely on him actually being in the act, but rather if he can perform it, he does it, which I think gives the furniture more merit because it can also help him with common types of CC like stuns. I also want to briefly mention how you said that the meta is very dynamic. I definitely agree on this note. I think that the furniture change is one thing people don't completely understand, made everything more tanky. So it really took the meta, at least in terms of campaign, to the slower side. I think it had a different effect on PvP, and we'll get to that in a second, but I do want to ask you something else. Many newer players that are F2P, for example, they come up with all these creative formations, like you said. And for example, they have very strong key pieces that they use to path through, especially. I think they have a tendency to do so at minimum power. Maybe it's like some sort of a hobby. I mean, it is for me too. And some of them looked over your data and got really surprised by the stuff that the whales use, obviously. They were like super blown back because they said, for example, how come Isolde used 0%? And then Hashi actually broke the other day to chapter 36, and she ended up using Isolde in a set while not using it in 35. So I really wanted to get your opinion on how does that stand, where some heroes just vanish and come through at those various points.
Chapter 35 is a weird one, given that the game stalled at chapter 34 for so long.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a whole load of players who were gathering power, sat at 34.56, waiting for the developers to drop 35.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got to 35 and I started looking at, for example, chapter 35.4, winning formations, I could see so many memes. I could see pure Hypogean lineups being ran because people were just so overpowered. So I could clearly see there was no thinking going on at all for the first few stages, and that's why I just excluded all that data. If I put that on there, it would be not a credible analysis at all. The first time I thought the data started getting credible was on 35.12, and even then it was very clear that there was a lot of brute force involved, and they weren't being challenged, they weren't pushing the edge. And it's only when we started flowing through a bit later that I think people started actually trying to really beat the stage. I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
first chunk of chapter 35 was just people's favorite lineups, so to speak. A little bit of thinking, a little bit of tweaking, but God Comp left, right, and center, Gwyneth Burst left, right, and center, and people were barely varying the Gwyneth Burst. Once they got to kind of the point where you got stuck, when you're starting to get to your cap at the level limit, towards the end of chapter 35, then innovative lineups started coming in. I don't know. I don't want to sound arrogant. I don't want to sound big-headed, but I also wonder whether me publishing the data of lineups used changed the people's behavior. Hashi, for example, may have said, "Oh, wait a second, I do like Isold. I do know loads of people copy me. If I pass the stage, my winning formation is likely to feature quite strongly in an analysis like this." And I do wonder whether that caused her to actually take another look at what she's doing and what that says to the community, and actually started trying to use kind of better lineups. I don't know. Isold is a beast. He was amazing in 35-56 and 35-60, and I do think he will feature in chapter 36. I mean, when I looked at the data, I just assumed, Isold just can't get going because he's too squishy, unfortunately, at that stage of the game. But yeah, it's obvious he's not going anywhere.
I hear you. So it's like a matrix. The meta is dynamic across two axes. First is how it changes over time with so many features being introduced, like furniture, signature items obviously blew everything. Signature item on enemies, I think, was also a big change that people don't completely understand. And on the other axis, it's how more and more players get through. So at first, it's like players like Hashi, and it's like a group of like 9 or 10 people that use the best macros, pay the most money, and are the most strategic too. And you put all this in tandem, and they're kind of what's dictating the meta for those stages. But then later, you see those lower and lower minimum power replays of people that have less to use. For example, I think like Isold is one thing that we may see in chapter 35 really rising in usage as time goes by, and as new
Absolutely.
features get introduced. Exactly. Um,
And it's iterative. So the first ones that go through are the ones with all the heroes at their disposal, can do a bit of brute force. The next wave of people have spent a bit less, have to squeeze their heroes a bit more, but they don't start on a blank piece of paper, so they can say, okay, Hashi's lineup, for example, Hashi's lineup worked on round one. I know that will work. I don't have those heroes, but I do think maybe instead of Khazad, I can use Solace there, or whatever. So they have the benefit of that experience, of the first wave's experience, to use slightly less expensive, so to speak, or top tier heroes to achieve the same thing. And then as that iterative process continues, by the time your Dolphins or your free to play players get there, I imagine they'll be able to push at a minimum power rating.
I hear you. And there's with this new event, I want to ask also about a different aspect of the game, and you tell me how much you want to talk about that, because obviously you're in cloud, you have all this internal testing. The new event allowed many new players to qualify for LC, so the upcoming LC should probably be way more interesting than past ones. And with that, many players are trying to pick up on some strategies or some stuff like that. What would you advise those players that just now got their first and maybe last in a while chance to actually compete in the highest levels of PvP?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question, actually. Um, you've already alluded to this. There's a lot of hero synergies and game mechanics that people don't fully understand, aren't discovered yet. And
Mhm.
the players who make their heroes sweat a bit harder, the players who push the minimum power rating, are the ones who have to work out new ideas, or use existing ideas in a different way to have a higher force multiplier for the team. So they know how to use partnerships in a way that can make not as good heroes do a lot more. And I also think they have the benefit, because they do so much more for each stage. They have to do so many more tries. They have to spend so much more time, coming up with what will work. That they have a strong grasp of what do they need to do to translate something that looks good on paper into something that works in practice. So they
Mhm.
know testing. They know they've got their ways of testing in campaign. And if what I think is going to happen in Heroes of Vesperia lands quite soon, they'll even have a very easy
Mhm.
way of testing in the PvP environment. That's a very good proxy to Legends Championship. They they won't these players won't rely on a rock paper scissors strategy. Burst beats this and that beats that. They're not going to use the same lineups, and these are also the same players that the traditional, let's say the whales or the winners or the reigning champions of a region are going to underestimate. So if I was going to give these players any advice, it would be do exactly what you do in campaign, but try and do that in PvP. Watch. I'm sure you watch replays in campaigns, watch replays in legend championships. Get all the data you can. Come up with your ideas. Make your heroes sweat the way you do in campaign, and test, test, and test.
I think that's a wonderful piece of advice. I really like it myself. I initially came up with this rock, paper, scissors kind of strategy myself when I got into my first LC. So there was this burst comp with Zolrath, Gwyneth, Aaron that's seeing all kinds of changes right now. And with that, you usually had Lorsan, and people started using Naka on one of its variants. So I found that Gorva really helps against Naka, but does terribly against Lorsan. I was so excited because I thought nobody knew about that. The second I got into some of the discords and I asked a few knowledgeable people, they showed me that I'm like a few months behind on everything. Like everybody knows this. So I was so surprised, like finding all these advanced tips. And I think those newer players that test new things are the biggest engine for us finding newer setups and discovering these new metas.
Absolutely. There is, unfortunately, when Elder Tree was introduced, it has shifted PvP side of things much more to pay to win, unfortunately. So before Elder Tree, upsets happened. It was much more innovative because a much wider player base could qualify. I know what you said with the current event. A lot wider base of players would be up for it. I mean, there would be top 10 in the Legends Challenger tournament. But I do think, unfortunately, it's not impossible, but Elder Tree does make it a lot harder to beat, the conventional meta for these players, unfortunately.
So you're saying the only way to go against those bigger players with Elder Trees and Furnitures is just to test, test, and test again and find those niche synergies that little people know about.
Exactly.
All right. I think that's a good message. Personally, I try to test a lot myself. I do it again sometimes with friends in my guild. I make all kinds of people set all kinds of sets. It's hard because not everybody has the same level of elder trees and stuff that I want to test against. But I think that's definitely an undervalued piece of advice. And how about Cloud? How are things working inside for you, being in one of those top guilds, led by Charles, by the way? Big shout out to Charles, doing a great job. How does the inside of Cloud look like? What kind of testing do you do, and what's important for you guys as you approach the game?
So I think I joined Cloud back in October last year, and at that point in time, it was quite a young guild in that it didn't have a lot of the infrastructure it has now. It didn't have the infrastructure diligence, the community, and it was Charles at the time. I think he recruited mostly up and coming PvP players. So we had a guild that was quite a relaxed group of PvP focused players. And when I joined in it back then, and I started competing in Legends Championship, I really got hooked on the PvP side of the game, and I really wanted to explore that side of things. And at that time in Region 8, the reigning champion was a Chinese player who actually invented the Zolrath Burst comp and had won the first 7 Legends Championship that existed in that region, and it was just way ahead of his time. And it wasn't, I started on a later server than him, so I was already on a deficit, both in terms of money spent, in terms of experience. And I was fortunate enough to find an in-game player like CSM, or in-game player that is CSM, who also wanted to do well in Legends Championship, and who, we had a great relationship. So we do a lot of testing with each other. That's how this all started. We wanted to discover new parts of the game, new game mechanics. We wanted to work out the best way of catching up, so to speak. So how do we get the most impact for any money we spend? And we wanted to make up that lost time we had against this, great innovative Chinese player. And it did take a bit of time, but we got there. And after about 2 months, we kind of built this infrastructure of testing ideas. I'd written some. I was in the process of starting to write guides to help leverage that experience for the benefit of the wider guild. And what was a real turning point for me and for CSM was when CSM did manage to beat that reigning champion in probably the most iconic Legends Championship match I've ever seen. He actually did. So he did the Zorath burst better than the person who invented Zorath burst. So the Chinese guy, I think that was the only mistake I've seen him made, but he put in Nomura instead of Lawson. And CSM knew exactly what he was doing, so he put in Lawson instead of Nomura, did a sweep, and it went just from strength to strength. So that was just after Tailene was introduced. The Chinese guild were using Tailene and Orthros, but not with the right back line. They were using Nara, Isabella, and Athalia, I think. I think that was it. Yeah. And so we did all our testing and realized Isabella doesn't work there. Yeah, great. You have a lot of burst damage at the back line, but you put Pharrell there, then that's just going to wipe the board. And we went from strength to strength. He won that. It was a turning point for Cloud, and that was when we realized we were onto something. The way we did our testing, the way we constructed our strategies, and we formed a small kind of core, PvP focused players, where it grew from there. And as over time, we managed to bring in more kind of successful PvP players. You've got after we set up Cloud9, we moved that infrastructure over there as well. But we have this PvP focus, which was fantastic. We tried to leverage that across the wider guild. So I started penning guides back in December last year, where I drafted I wrote a guide on how to get the most impact for your money, concept PvP principles, etc. We had that support network, which was very PvP focused at the time. With campaign was part of it. We did save all our winning formations, etc. But the next turning point for us was when the Abyssal expedition came. That I think was a turning point for a lot of guilds. And we moved from just a PvP focused guild to actually, wait a second, we need to find ways of working with each other. We need to be online. We need to be active. We need to communicate effectively. So we had to kind of revamp a lot of what we do. We had already been on the natural movement from in-game communication to Discord communication. I mean, it's not in-game chat's not conducive to sharing test results or sharing guides. So we had moved our comms into Discord. Unfortunately, before the first real Abyssal expedition in June, we actually started a project to set up Cloud9 in April. Instead of having a one very strong full guild, we had two strong but only 2/3 full guilds, which wasn't the best for our first Abyssal expedition. But it was, no regrets. It's been a fantastic journey. So we had to build more infrastructure so that Cloud and Cloud9 could connect and work together. And we also had to build the infrastructure in place to be successful at something like Abyssal Expedition. It's still a work in progress, but a lot of this came about organically. And I guess if you were to talk about it from what would it be like if I was in Cloud perspective, you'd probably have a sense that you would have been in touch with Charles. He handles all the recruitment. He probably would have recruited you, so you'd have a friendship with Charles. You'd see the guides I've written. Some of them are public, some of them aren't, and so you'll hopefully feel supported in that sense. And you'll see that there's quite an active community across both guilds that do work together, and it is still quite social. We haven't lost that side of things from when we started. But if you were to look under the bonnet of how the guild is run, you've got Charles, who handles most of the recruitment. You've got me, who handles a lot of the support, kind of the theory crafting or the guides for our players, which when I think it would benefit the wider community, I release it more widely. And you've got another layer of moderators and guild deputies and officers who support me and Charles. And it's fantastic. They do all the legwork. If a crisis hits, if something really bad happens and we need a plan of action, they're there, and we divvy up the work and spread it out so no one person burns out. So yeah, we've got that structure in place, which we had to build after last Abyssal expedition. But yeah, it's quite organized, probably can do with being more organized, and we're on our way there.
So guys, you heard it here. This is what it feels like to be in one of the most competitive guilds in the game. Hot mention, you just recently in this Abyssal expedition, you got some top 5s, didn't you?
Yeah. I mean, last one we got one top 5. This one we've got a few. We aren't purely an Abyssal expedition focused guild, and we would love to. Our aim is to ideally be in the top 10. We aren't going to be able to make top 1, I think. But I know that there are a lot of guilds out there who do the same thing as we do, have the same aims as we have to make top 10 or top 1. I don't know. We have done a survey with our own members to understand, what they want. Do they want to be top 10? Do they want to give this a lot of energy? Because we don't want to push our guild and then have a whole load of them burn out afterwards. It's the guild does come first above recognition out there, and it's fantastic. We've got a few firsts, claiming some cities and that kind of thing. And hopefully we will get the recognition at the other end. Last Abyssal expedition, I think we placed 35th and 37th. Hopefully this Abyssal we can place quite a lot higher, ideally top 10. But I mean, from our perspective, the guild has to come first. They've got to be bought in. They've got to want to do it. And when you've got a guild where you've had players that have been there for more than a year, who some of them are very active, some of them aren't so active. We're not going to get rid of all of our less active players just to have a guild full of perfect players for Abyssal. So we do know that we're not, there's a balance here, so to speak. And yeah, I mean, hopefully, if everything goes to plan, touch wood, yeah, hopefully we will place well this Abyssal.
All right. I'm hearing a lot of things that are somewhat parallel between you and some of the other top guilds. I want to quickly draw on that. So you see, first of all, you treat Cloud9 as a first guild. Like, it's not a sister guild in the sense that discriminate against it. It's like the weaker players goes there. That's one of the things I also caught from Charles, that you really have a lot of respect and a lot of your strongest players in Cloud9, and they're all kind of united under this whole thing that's Cloud, whether it comes to infrastructure, Discord, and of course, correct me if I'm wrong on any of that. And another thing I hear is that burnout is obviously a big issue with those top players, and that's a thing that happens. But you're one of those guilds that also works on positive reinforcement. You don't kick instantly players that go a little less active, that are less engaged. And this is a different philosophy. For example, with some of these Chinese guilds, I've seen it, at least from the view of an outsider, right? You see the Taiwanese guilds that obviously, like, you're not active for a certain amount of hours, you're instantly kicked and there's no way back in. Whereas I think you and casuals too, you have this approach of, first of all, positive reinforcement, and second, getting the guild to the best quality of players and trying to keep them away from burning. How do you feel that's done in Cloud?
So, I mean, well, big part of that is support.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that happen that you can't control. If there are in real life problems that occur, people will quit. You can't do anything about that. But Charles and I thought a lot about this early this year before we set up Cloud9. We thought a lot about what the guild should stand for and what the guild does stand for. And we've always thought a guild should be there to support its players. It's not there for the players to support it, and that's been our philosophy. That's why I write these guides. That's why Charles personally speaks to everybody in both guilds. And we're not a guild that says, I mean, yeah, there are recruitment requirements that any competitive guild will have them. We don't have an open door policy that anyone can join. We do have requirements before somebody can join. I'm not saying we're completely open, but it's like an agreement between us and our players. The guild will offer you support. We're here to give you the best experience you can have, to maximize your potential. But equally, we want you to try and reach your maximum potential and try and be the best player you can be. And that's the deal. So from a burnout perspective, I get to go back to your question. I'm hopeful that that type of relationship would support players when times get tough, and if there's a struggle for whatever reason. And it may even be players have to quit for a long time, but hopefully when they come back, they know they can come back.
I hear you. And that segues me pretty well into another topic. You're talking about the community in the guild. Let's talk a little bit about the community outside the guild. I think you're one of the endgame players that's done the most for people outside of his guild, with all the guides that you published, heavily researched, with all your collaborations, for example, with Volkin. I wanted to ask you why you do that.
I'm not an extrovert person. I know that might sound ironic being on the podcast, but it all started from trying to win Region 8, basically. What did we need to do to get from this deficit we have against the reigning champion to catch up? And once, CSM and I were on that journey and working so hard in that space, Charles was like, well, why don't you why didn't you guys share some of that? Why didn't you advise some other players? And that's where it started, first as advice, and then when that grew and became really big, I started writing guides, and these guides were
Mhm.
kept in-house, of course. So, if you're writing a PvP guide, you don't want to share that with everybody, with the world. Or I don't personally. So we were on that journey, and back then, back in 2019, it was a very, very different atmosphere between guilds. A
Mhm.
lot of guilds were competing with each other to get the next up and coming player that's going to be very strong in the next region of the Legends Championship. So there was a lot of competition to recruit the same players, and that can create not toxicity, but conflict between us and other guilds, and that also lent itself to being a bit more private and a bit more introvert. But that changed. I personally I speak to Newton quite regularly. We built relationships with other guilds. The whole atmosphere of the game became more open in as time went by. I personally saw a lot of the game change with all the new mechanics they were introducing. And when the Abyssal expedition, actually I need to backtrack a bit, but when Taline was introduced back in November, December last year, that had such a big change to the game that I thought immediately I
Mhm.
need to set up a test account. I need to see these things coming as early as I can and test them as early as I can so we can get ahead of the curve. So I set up a test account. I shared all of those experiences in Guild. The next big step with the Abyssal expedition, in its first form back in whenever it was, May, um, when that first came about, I knew there was going to be huge. This is really complicated. This is really confusing. We need to explain that, and I wanted to explain it to my own guild. At the same time, the first Abyssal expedition, it wasn't competitive, so we could have a completely open doors policy. And I remember Artie from Amicitia, Amicitia. I don't know how to pronounce that.
Mhm.
So Amicitia. Is that how to say it?
I kind of. It's
Anyway,
okay.
kind of. Yeah. Sorry. Artie reached out to me, and I wanted to get some guidance out there for my guild. Artie wanted to get some guidance out there for the guild, for that guild as well. So we worked together, and I really enjoyed doing that, and it opened up my eyes, and I thought, actually, you know what, that it is a good community out there. They do react positively to having some guidance, and that, I wouldn't say it made me want to write a lot of guides, but it did make me revisit my personal position of being introvert and only doing things for the benefit of or not only doing things for the benefit of cloud, but my primary focus being cloud. And I realized that actually a lot of what I do, yeah, it's for the benefit of cloud, and sometimes that should stay that way, but sometimes it can be shared more widely. And yeah, that was a big turning point. I mean, I'd always liked Volkin's videos. I mean, he's such a charismatic guy, he's such a legend that
Definitely.
yeah, it worked out so well for us that he wanted to join a end game guild around about the time of the second Abyssal expedition. He wanted to be able
Mhm.
to do videos on that, and wanted access to the kind of players we had in cloud, and that was just a fantastic opportunity. He joined us. I've always wanted to be on, to work with him on some videos, and so yeah, of course, I let him do summons on my account or furniture summons, and when he asked me to write a guide, of course I write it, whether that's end game hero tier list or whatever. So it's been great to have Volkin join us. It's really raised our profile, and I really think that actually it's changed my whole attitude to whether I should do stuff for Guild or for Cloud, or whether I should do stuff for the wider community. As a lot of the times it can be both. And that's the direction I'm heading at the moment.
I love that a lot. I think exposing it to a wider array of players gets more players involved. And in a sense, the more player you get involved in the end game, the better game you get because you have more diversity, you have more different kinds of thoughts, which makes the game less stale. I absolutely love the active community, especially due to the people that enable it. So I want to credit you. I want to give a quick shout out to all the people that make guides outside. There's also people that enable that, like Kale that we've had here in the past. And I do want to wrap up with the note that will, I think, help the people that view my channel, because obviously they're so far ahead in the campaign and everything. I'd like it to end up with a fact, whether it's big or small, any hero, just something that's less known for most people and you think might be useful.
Oh, wow, really putting me on the spot there. I wasn't expecting this question.
Yeah?
Um, Well, I've always liked Nimisu. He's a totem
Mm-hmm.
guy, as Volkin would say. There was one Legends Championship final where I credit my loss at that final to Nimisu, to Totem Guy. I know it's a long shot and there's a lot of RNG involved to get the totems in the right place, but I had Orthros, Talene, Ferial, Athalia, Nara, so at the time the meta, and my
Mm-hmm.
opponent had exactly the same lineup, but put Nimisu over Athalia in that line, and his team wiped mine.
Really?
Yeah.
Who was Nomisu in front? Like he was in front of Nara, Athalia?
So from from memory, I think it was Pharrell. But
Oh, so it was in that safe slot.
yeah, and he may have been in front of Athalia. I can't 100% remember, but I remember saying there's no way that guy is going to win that matchup, and completely wiped. No heroes lost, all of mine dead. It was, yeah, it's not. I've tested that to the death since then, and I can't reproduce
Mm-hmm.
that consistently. So there's a lot of luck involved. But
Mm-hmm.
that really, I played WoW back in the day in World of Warcraft, and I loved, back vanilla time, so 15 years ago, and I loved being
Mm-hmm.
a shaman or shaman. So for me, I'd always had a soft spot for totems. Just I didn't think he was viable until I was shown. So yeah, I've always loved Nimisu or Totem Guy, and it's people know it in Discord that I rate him, and it's one of my first maulers to have a maxed out signature. Right? But yeah, so I guess if you're out there and you don't know me from Discord, then yeah, I'd say I'd rate Nimisu. Yeah, definitely an underrated hero.
All right, so you've heard it here. If you're one of those newer players qualifying for PvP, PvE, and just searching for that one hero to make things change, you've heard it here. Not a common piece of advice, but a very meaningful one nonetheless from Shizzam. Shizzam, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here. I'm very happy that we got to talk, and thank you for coming along.
Thank you very much for having me.